If there's any subject in retro gaming that gets covered endlessly, it's the 16-bit wars. SNES versus Genesis! I say Genesis because most of the time this subject's covered from the American point of view, the land of blast processing and so on, where Sega gave Nintendo a bloody nose but ultimately the big N won the fight. And before the 16-bits came along, it's not like there was much of one. There's not an awful lot of viewpoints from the land of Europe, however, where things were so very different. And that's what I hope to cover a little today. I don't really intend to add to the technical face-offs and what have you. This video's all about how the war between Sega and Nintendo went here in Europe, particularly in the UK because, well, that's my home. Anyway, here goes. Now the funny thing about the NES and the Master System is that it's almost the reverse of what happened in the US, almost anyway. In the US, one of the main troubles that the Master System had was that it was first marketed badly by Sega themselves, and then marketed badly by a third party, Tonka. The Master System never had a prayer going up against an already fully established Nintendo, who were handling their machine directly. In Europe, the reverse was true. With no real base over here, Nintendo passed the NES over to a third party, Mattel. Marketing in Europe, therefore, was always going to be a bit of a challenge for Nintendo. You might look at something like, the ZX Spectrum and mock it, saying that the NES is clearly superior in every department connected to games, and, well, yes, it clearly is. Not to mention that the Speccy and the C64 were already years old. And yet, the new console on the block couldn't beat them. The hold of the microcomputers was still very strong in 1986. And hey, you can't ignore the value of cheap software. A NES cartridge could cost 50 quid for one game, maybe. Full price cassettes and floppies for the microcomputers were around 10 quid at the most, and an extensive library of budget games were there that were around £3 to £4 a pop. That's one of the main reasons why the NES couldn't beat the microcomputers, amongst others. However, that's not to say that Sega immediately started going gangbusters with the Master System, quite the opposite in fact. For a start, Sega didn't arrive on UK shores until 1987, giving Nintendo well over a year's head start. The Master System was also distributed and marketed by a third party, the UK games company Mastertronic, and Sega, well, they completely screwed it up. Mastertronic marketed the machine very well, lots of orders were put in for it, but then Sega weren't able to deliver all their inventory on time. It took until late in 1987, literally Boxing Day, for machines to finally come through, by which time a lot of retailers had cancelled those orders, the Christmas rush had obviously been missed, and Mastertronic had lost a ton of money. They were close to bankruptcy. Not exactly a nice experience for them. This is not an Amstrad in France type situation. It's not like Sega purposefully went at the European market with both barrels, and in fact they came incredibly close to ruining it all right from the off through woeful organisation. So in order to avoid total bankruptcy, Mastertronic's bosses sold up everything to the UK-based business empire Virgin, and the company was rechristened as Virgin Mastertronic in 1988. And here's where the Master System's fortunes started to change. Virgin were sitting now on all this inventory, and they were more than happy to market it as a superior alternative to the now really quite old Speccy and C64 for 100 quid, also a lot less than the higher-end Amiga and Atari ST computers. Virgin's strong base in Europe was a big advantage over Nintendo's, and it inarguably helped them to beat Nintendo in the continent. With Virgin so strong in Europe, they had the in-store presence and the marketing power to beat a company in Mattel that, well, weren't European to begin with. The Master System was, in the end, the machine that finally started to break the stranglehold that computers had had through the whole decade. The Atari VCS and its competitors had been virtually non-existent over here, and the NES itself, while getting an earlier start than the Master System, had struggled to break the C64 and ZX Spectrum's hold on the market. Why the Master System though? Well, it was competitive price-wise for a start. £99 was about as much as you would pay for one of the popular microcomputers. It didn't do anything but games, but then, by this time the Speccy, C64, Amstrad and all that, they'd dropped all pretense of being computers that could do homework, office stuff and all that in one box. The only selling point for them was games. It worked, but they'd always be vulnerable to a machine that could do games better, and the Master System ended up being it. And let's not forget something that the UK absolutely loved, the built-in game. Even though it was only the basic maze game at first, just having any game at all was a foot in the door, and something that appeals so much to a European, particularly a UK market, that is a little bit thriftier and enjoys the convenience of not having to buy a game in order to do anything at all with the machine. When the new Master System 2 and later PAL Master System 1 started carrying one of the system's best titles, Alex Kidd in Miracle World, as the built-in game, that was all she wrote pretty much. And as a result, old Alex is very well known as a retro gaming icon over here. I knew people who had a Master System and didn't have anything for it except Alex Kidd. It was enough for them. Whenever I talk to regular people casually about old games, Alex Kidd always seems to crop up somewhere as a game that people have very fond memories of. Believe it or not, he is quite special to us. And so the life of the Master System just went on and on, well into the 16-bit era where, again, because people are thrifty, it had a great life as the low-budget alternative to the Mega Drive, likely disappointing Sonic-hungry kids across the land every Christmas. There's lots of ports of Mega Drive titles for the Master System that most American folk have probably never even seen, the likes of Sonic 2, Mercs and the almighty Streets of Rage 2, along with plenty of PAL exclusives like Ninja Gaiden, Power Strike 2 and Alex Kidd in Shinobi World. In Europe, the Master System lasted right up to the later 16-bit years, finally fading out around 1994. Considering that the last titles for the US Master System and Japanese Mark III were 1991's Sonic the Hedgehog and 1989's Bomber Raid respectively, that's quite impressive. And it goes without saying that the high majority of the 13 million Master Systems sold throughout its official existence were thanks to Europe. You might not believe this, but the last commercially released game for the Master System in Europe, well, France as it goes, was the Smurfs Travel the World by Infogrames. It came out in 1996. And yet, I don't really want to praise Sega all away for this, considering how close they came to screwing it up in the beginning. If Mastertronic had went completely under, taking all that inventory with it, what would have happened? The success of the Master System has as much to do, if not more to do, with Virgin as it has to do with Sega. And it's not like the NES wasn't bloody good either. Plenty of Nintendo's classics came out over here, and Nintendo were happy to keep the system going, eventually, like the Master System, as the low-budget alternative to the SNES. It just didn't really have the same advantages that it had in the US, where the NES was basically the saviour of the entire video game market, unopposed by everybody else. Going into a market where there was no Crash and there were already a lot of big fishers roaming around, it struggled. Despite the big bump in the road that microcomputers had in 1985, they came back in 1986 revitalised as full-on games machines. Again, it's not as if the NES couldn't blow the Spectrum and the like out of the water both technically and with games, but without all that much major marketing to rely on, there was a lot of resistance to the change that the NES offered. Perhaps the people were just more ready for it when Sega came along 2 years later. And the classic fuck Europe mentality in releasing games didn't help either. Super Mario Bros. 3, for example, you know, the greatest NES game of all time probably, was originally released in Japan in 1988, didn't come out in the States until February of 1990. You think that's bad? Well, it didn't come out in the PAL regions until August of 1991. That's 2 months after the release of Sonic the Hedgehog, by the way. It kinda goes to show what Nintendo's thoughts on the NES in Europe were around then, to be honest. Still, we did get to the almighty Mr. Gimmick in Europe. Well, Scandinavia anyways. It was pretty clear for Nintendo that something had to change. The first order of business for Nintendo was, of course, to set up a base in Europe, which they did in 1990, ending their reliance on third parties. This certainly allowed them to handle the NES a bit better in the short term, prolonging the life of the console. But the main purpose was to set up for the release of the SNES in Europe, which we'll get to in due course. For now, we'll look quickly at the Mega Drive's launch in Europe, which happened on November the 30th, 1990, selling for the cheap cost of £190. There were plenty of titles to choose from at launch too. 18 titles were released for the system on the same day, a number that seems ridiculous now, but hell, the system had already been out in other areas for 2 years by this point, and I guess Sega figured, hey, just pump them all out there. You obviously had the big hitters like Golden Axe, Ghouls and Ghosts and The Revenge of Shinobi, but there were also lesser known titles like Mystic Defender and the almighty TRUHTON. Alex Kidd made his not all that spectacular return with the Enchanted Castle, and who could forget the European release of the almighty Super Thunderblade? Yeah, I could. But generally all the main genres of the system were represented, with a bunch of sports titles and even a bit of puzzling in the form of Zoom. The pack-in title, as it was in the US, was the Wise from Yo Grave-tastic Altered Beast. By this point Sega too had abandoned the third-party approach and set up a base in Europe for their operations, although most decisions would come from Sega of America. Aside from that, business was pretty normal really. The Sega Mega Drive performed well. They already had a strong user base and marketing presence, so it certainly wasn't like it was in the US where the Genesis had to scrimp and gradually set up a base from scratch in the days before Sonic. The Mega Drive did decent business against its main competition, the new resurgence of computers in the shape of the smash hit Amiga 500. It was in mid to late 1991 when Nintendo would go on full assault at long last. The incoming Super Nintendo was heavily hyped in all areas, receiving tons of press in magazines and the like. It is funny looking back on it all. I should say that it's not like us folk in Europe had no knowledge of Mario and what have you. He was very well known indeed, as he was across the world. But if you didn't have a NES, well, you'd probably know him more from things that weren't games. Nintendo's cross-media marketing came over here too, and we saw the likes of the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, the Legend of Zelda cartoons, the Mario-based choose-your-own-adventure books. They were all still around and they occupied plenty of space in games magazines, but quite a few people's first experience of Mario proper, I reckon, including myself, would be on the SNES. You certainly can't blame Nintendo for going all out months in advance of the original's launch. After all, Sega had already drawn their ace. Sonic's launch in June of 1991 went in Europe as it went everywhere else. It was the game that set the console apart and made Mega Drive the undisputed games machine to own. And of course, Sonic went out unopposed here, with no Nintendo to compete with as of yet. This is where I came in, getting a Mega Drive with Sonic, the new pack-in title, for my birthday that year. And yes, it was wonderful, especially for someone who'd only had the Spectrum before it. I imagine a lot of other children felt the same way. It was a glorious time and Nintendo was just, well, not much to really think about. And also, we can't forget that Sonic was pretty clearly the point where it was clear that Sega were going for the West more as opposed to the East. But anyway, that soon changed. At long last, the SNES would arrive on European shores on April the 11th, 1992. Rather smartly, they staggered their releases. Unlike the Mega Drive, the SNES would only launch with 3 titles in Europe: Super Mario World, F-Zero and Super Tennis. This was pretty smart because the N had plenty more in reserve. They couldn't afford to stop the momentum. Nintendo continued to bring their games over gradually, like a rising crescendo. First it's PILOTWINGS, Final Fight and SimCity, then moving through Super Castlevania 4, Super Ghouls and Ghosts and UN Squadron, bringing out a Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past fairly late into the year. Most people may only buy one of these games, seeing as how generally the price of SNES games was that little bit higher than Mega Drive games, usually about a tenner or so. But considering the sheer quality of the games on offer, the philosophy was that surely one of them would make you desperately want a SNES. And even if you didn't quite get it yet, it was all building up to the game that Nintendo had picked as their ace in the hole in Europe, the one that they thought would make you want the system more than any other. The SNES port of Street Fighter II was released in the summer of '92 in all other areas, but it would be released on December the 17th in Europe. More than that, it would be the SNES's new pack-in title. Although they had several over the years, the SF2 pack-in is probably the one people in Europe remember the most. One thing I also remember was that the SNES was pretty much the first time that you could actively demo a console in stores, and just playing Street Fighter 2 on there with 2 controllers set up so that someone else could even play with you was just amazing. It seemed just like the game that you played every weekend down in the arcades. Americans would be familiar with this practice long before that with the Play Choice 10 and what have you, but this was one of the first times it came to the UK. And after playing Street Fighter 2 on the SNES, you wanted it. The SNES was now the absolute machine to have for Christmas, and the pack was hugely successful. I ended up getting my SNES Len too, as did a lot of others. And so, with Street Fighter 2 and all the other brilliant titles they'd released, Nintendo had firmly established themselves as Sega's serious rival in Europe. Fun was about to start. We'll go into the second half of the war later on, but for now there's some time to look at other main differences between the 2 consoles in Europe and, well, everywhere else. There's quite a few differences. The main one being that Sega didn't really go in for the aggressive attack ads that they used in the States over here. There weren't all that many direct comparisons with Nintendo, there weren't many big celebrities and sports folk hawking the product, and the term blast processing, believe it or not, it wasn't a thing. I didn't even hear of blast processing until I found it on Sega websites. The British public doesn't really go in for direct attacks on the competition. It's all a little crass and, well, American. And so instead the Mega Drive and the SNES were mostly advertised on their own terms. Anyway, let's look at some ads. America had Welcome to the Next Level, Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't, and a high-pitched rapid-fire squeal of Sega! The Mega Drive and Sega in general didn't have as many slogans here in Europe, but the one that everybody remembers is To Be This Good Takes Ages, Ages transmorphing into Sega at the end of the ads. The most famous Mega Drive ad is possibly this one, where some boffin does Frankenstein-esque experiments while another cool guy speaks things at you.
Hey, you.
Now, sir.
Give me the Cyber Razor Cut.
Cyber Razor Cut.
Mega Drive games. They get faster, they get harder. What are you going to do to keep up?
Next.
You mean it works?
To be this good takes things.
And it's all filmed in probably the same disused power station in Battersea where about 20,000 early 90s UK music videos were shot, from the Stereo MCs Connected to East 17's seminal British classic House of Love. The cool guy is probably the big UK thing here. He actually had a name and everything, although I forget it at the moment, and was positioned as the person that you want to be. The vision of yourself that you see in your mind's eye when you're going down an escalator and pretending that you're in some fucking Guy Ritchie movie. What a twat. But hey, we like keeping up with the Joneses after all, so the advert has to have that little bit of an aspirational quality there. Other than that, well, there's games, lots of games, and weird machines spinning around people's eyes. What more could you ask for? The spokesperson for the SNES in the UK also had a name, and was also a person you probably wanted to be. Only difference is it wasn't some knob, it was Rick Bloody Mail.
Ah! My friends at Nintendo have placed 4 Super Mario games on the same cart for less than 50 of your pounds. Super Mario Bros. 1 is pretty tricky. Super Mario Bros. 2 is a little more advanced. Super Mario Bros. 3 is... But Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels is so difficult, it could actually unhinge the balance of your mind.
Aren't you that talentless celebrity women find repellent?
See what I mean? He's completely tonto.
Mario All-Stars, an infuriating innovative Nintendo.
The selection of mail is a pretty good one. Nintendo kind of wanted to appeal to everyone they could, and in Mail they found someone who was basically loved by kids and adults alike. Mail's one as the face of Nintendo came at a good time too. This was right when he was at the peak of his popularity and still on TV quite a lot of the time. Mail generally acts as the straight man in his adverts, oddly enough, but there is still naturally a bit of kookiness here and there. And hey, you know, of course the adverts are good. I mean, they may not be anything entirely memorable, but it's Rick Mail for Christ's sake. The Mega Drive's adverts do perhaps stick out that little bit more, even if they are in retrospect a bit more cringeworthy. The thing that they generally do have over Nintendo's adverts is that there is a lot more game in them. Sega's adverts are stacked full of rapid-fire game footage, demonstrating just how many games they had on offer and making them all look pretty spectacular. I mean, even something as humdrum as Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing is going to look great if you're just showing it for a second. The best thing you can say about these adverts is that it's perhaps an early prototype for what came later. It felt as though Sega were gunning for a teenage and young adult market, pitching their commercials that little bit older, and even Nintendo's ads were more general and not focused solely at the younger market. You don't see all that many kids or classrooms or what have you in any of these ads, nor much blatant playing up of things that would be considered nerdy. You know, the nerdy commercial where the bullies flick the guy's ears. That shit wouldn't fly over here, ever. There's a definite stab at cool that sort of worked, although that was more to do with the quality of the machine itself and the games that were on offer, to be honest. But perhaps it is a sign of things to come. Needless to say, the PlayStation would end up doing it a lot better. Also, we can't forget the work that Sega and Nintendo were doing on the ground, particularly Sega in this regard, it has to be said. This was the period where they, or rather Sega Operations UK, almost tried to position themselves as if they were a British company, like they were making up for what happened with Mastertronic all that time ago. If Sega wanted to do something in the press, then a proper British spokesperson would be on hand to do just that. They were so much more visible than Nintendo at all the big events, throwing their hats in wherever they could. Hell, they even made a deal to bring the Sega channel over to the UK in 1996 at a time when it could almost seem pointless. And let's not forget Sega World, a line of arcades and general palaces of fun throughout the country, although the most famous one is possibly at the Trocadero in London. They were all over the shop. Sega may not have been giving Nintendo shit over their console, but they did do quite a bit of work from the ground, whereas Nintendo was perhaps that bit more isolated. Thanks to that, Sega probably just about managed to win the advertising war here. Rick Mail alone does make it pretty close, but perhaps it wasn't quite enough. Now, it would be silly not to say anything at all about the handheld systems, although the outcome is pretty obvious really. This was a fight that Nintendo did win. Still, the Game Gear didn't do too badly in Europe. People liked the chunkiness of it, they liked that it was in colour, and they loved columns. That game generally always had a pretty good reputation in Europe, more so than it had in other parts of the world, I reckon. It helps that the Game Gear's columns is easily the best version of the game to boot. There was even a little market for some of the handheld's kookier add-ons like its TV tuner and what have you, or a converter that would let it play Master System games. Still, it wasn't ever going to be enough to beat the Game Boy and its Tetris-based juggernaut. All the add-ons and what have you released for the Game Boy, and a camera is quite a bit kookier than a TV tuner to be sure, don't really matter, because Tetris was all a Game Boy really needed. It is the most successful game of all time after all. And hey, it's not like there aren't about 50 or so other brilliant Game Boy games that you could play aside from Tetris. The Game Gear not exactly being the most convenient of handheld systems didn't help much either, with its short battery life meaning that you'd probably want to keep the AC adapter close to hand. Still, I myself got a lot of love out of the system, no doubt about that. And yeah, I mean, there's not all that much else to say here. The story here isn't especially different to the rest of the world. There's no twist in the tale where I reveal that the most successful handheld in Europe was actually the Atari Lynx. Game Boy was king, simple as that. Mind you, a lot of the Game Boy owners that I knew always seemed to have those super duper 138-in-1 or whatever carts that Nintendo probably didn't quite like all that much. So, what about the games? Generally, a lot of the biggest titles for the two systems in the UK were similar to those in the US, with the odd difference here and there. Just as the SNES had the likes of Super Mario Kart and Donkey Kong Country, which was gigantic in Europe, the Mega Drive had all the Sonic games and their version of Aladdin. Virgin Interactive's quite stunningly well-animated platformer is possibly the best-selling third-party title on both systems, with NBA Jam and The Lion King providing very close competition. Some differences could be a bit obvious. Games like John Madden Football didn't do quite as well sales-wise in Europe as they did in the US, but even then that's not to say they did badly. The UK in particular had a real big love for NFL in the early 90s, and we got Madden absolutely. The press loved it and the game sold very well. It may be an American sport, but you can't ignore such quality. Seriously, even Bill Walsh's college football got a European release. What do we know about American college football teams? I mean, that should probably tell you something. As I alluded to previously, I also remember Super Mario All-Stars being particularly massive over here. It was the Christmas '93 SNES packing title, replacing SF2. It was huge everywhere, so this isn't particularly special, but it was for us, for myself, and I reckon a few others. It was the first time we'd fully experienced classic Mario in all of its glory. And while SF2 is fresh in the memory, considering that the Mega Drive was top of the hill here, it should surprise no one that one of the most successful Mega Drive titles of them all was Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. There were of course a lot of games that we didn't get, chief amongst them being some major RPGs, mainly SNES ones. We didn't get Chrono Trigger on the SNES, or Earthbound. Hell, the SNES didn't even get Super Mario RPG, which is amazing to me. We didn't get either of the Luna games on the Mega CD, and we didn't get any Final Fantasy game until the arrival of good old number 7 on the PS1. Well, except for, of all games, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, rechristened in Europe as Mystic Quest Legend. The RPGs that largely did come here were action-based ones, with the likes of Secret of Mana and Illusion of Gaia, known over here as Illusion of Time, doing okay business. SNES folk in particular were very poorly served. The only thing a SNES-owning RPG fan in Europe could shout about was that they got the much-loved but understandably obscure TERRANIGMA in Europe, and the US didn't. The Mega Drive missed a couple too. The absolutely brilliant WARSONG, one of the MD's most startling and dramatic strategy RPGs, didn't make it. The brooding American RPG Shadow one of the most atmospheric and open games on the system, also never made it, although the much more adventurous SNES RPG game did. Still, the action RPGs like Crusader of Senti, known to us as Soleil, and Beyond Oasis, inexplicably titled The Story of THOR over here, both hit European soil, and obviously we got the core Sega titles like Sword of Vermilion, the Shining Force games, and of course, all 4 Phantasy Stars. Hell, Phantasy Star was one of the few titles around over here where someone could experience a proper non-action, non-strategy classic JRPG. RPGs aside, a lot of titles did get odd little name changes here and there, sometimes even more. A murky copyright issue involving a German company was the reason why Star Fox's name was changed to Star Win, and why that game's N64 sequel was called Lylat Wars. Sticking with Germany, their censorship laws were the reason why the original Contra became PROBOTECTOR, so that humans weren't seen to shoot other humans, and the series stuck to that in Europe rigidly, meaning that we got Super PROBOTECTOR Alien Rebels on the SNES, and confusingly another game called PROBOTECTOR for the Mega Drive that is, of course, Contra Hardcore. Castlevania Bloodlines was also inexplicably renamed Castlevania The New Generation in PAL territories for reasons? Ickiness over the word blood? I mean, whatever would Vincent Price have said? As those interviewing toidles found out, European territories, particularly Germany, hate the word ninja, and if you say it 3 times then a 7-year-old kid's gonna get a Death Star to the eyeball. Which of course means that Ninja Gaiden was always called Shadow Warriors over here. Oh, and Ninja Gaiden 3 wasn't ever released in Europe either. The European version of the absolutely fantastic Ninja Warriors again avoided this somehow, although it did somehow manage to earn another meaningless New Generation suffix, just like Castlevania, perhaps due to the original game's popularity in the territory. Oh, and going back to Castlevania again, the not particularly well-liked SNES version of Wonder of Blood, usually known as Dracula X, received the title of Castlevania Vampire's Kiss, for no discernible reason at all as far as I can tell. Lastly, and perhaps most annoyingly, the game with perhaps the greatest title in the history of everything, LucasArts' Zombies Ate My Neighbours. Us folk in Europe didn't much care for that at all, and so the game was retitled over here as simply Zombies. It's not quite the same, is it? Still, there was the odd title where Europe did get one up over the US, with the odd PAL exclusive. I've already mentioned TERRANIGMA. I'm honestly not a big fan of this game, at all, but Europe did get Treasure's much loved and stupidly hard boss fest Alien Soldier, which only ever came to the States via the Sega channel. Similarly, Capcom's remastered collection of classic Mega Man titles, The Wily Wars, was also released on KART in Europe. Not that it's any easier to get either of these games in Europe, you understand, they are both staggeringly expensive. A bunch of European platformers also never made it stateside, including the absolutely outstanding Flink. This is honestly one of the best looking games you can get on your Mega Drive, and it doesn't play half bad either. A real shame that it never came out worldwide. You'll also be happy to know that we got tons more ports from the Amiga, including Cannon Fodder and Sensible Soccer. We happily played these while Yanks struggled with the wretched likes of Technocop and Onslaught. On the SNES side, there's the odd Japanese game. Europe managed to get the odd backdraft-tastic cult title from Human known as the Firemen. But even better than that, they got a couple of classic shooters, the super duper cute 'em up Poppin' Twin B, and the forever irreverent original Parodius, a game that I remember doing quite well over here as it goes. Oh, and of course there's games for sports like rugby, cricket and football management that no American is ever going to give any kind of shit about. Which doesn't mean that you should spend the rest of your life having not played the utterly brilliant international rugby like I told you to a year or so ago. And finally, a brief word on pronunciation. What about it? Why do Americans say SNES and British folks say SNES? Where exactly does SNES or NES come from? This is a very sensitive issue, you understand, and it's a debate that could easily result in someone getting glassed after a few drinks. And hell, it's not like it's the same folk all the way down the line. Some Americans say SNES. And unbelievably, some British folk will actually take the trouble of pronouncing every letter, presumably while shoving a hero sandwich down their throat and listening to Hootie and the Blowfish like some pathetic Yankee wannabe. Hell, I've even heard on an Australian video someone pronounce Sega as Sega.
The Sega Master System 2 strikes again with the toughest games in town from $29.95 to $69.95. Wonder Boy 3, Battle Outrun, The Ninja, Rastan. The Sega Master System 2 Serious Fun.
Sega? I mean, what? Anyway, all of this makes me think that perhaps it's just a journalism thing. Whenever you watch the Games Master folk or whoever talking about Nintendo products, it's SNES or NES. It's just easier to say, flows nicely, looks like it can be a proper acronym even if it might not exactly be one. Somewhere deep in the basement of future publishing they probably thought it out one day and NES won. Personally, I'd never heard NES or SNES said any other way until I started watching the Angry Video Game Nerd on YouTube. And that perhaps explains the odd comment I get wondering why on earth I'm saying SNES like that. You say tomato, I say tomato, and so forth. It's a bit of fun, in any case. Until someone loses an eye, anyways. From 1993 onwards, the war was, well, quite amazing. I can't think of any other console war that was quite so neck and neck, and it was a pretty good time to be a part of. These were golden years, with the release of classic game after classic game. And it was the cause of 1,000,001 playground arguments to boot. Wonderful times. This would continue until 1995 when, as we've already went into before, Sega managed to screw up royally with the launch of the Saturn. Not only that, but the decision to immediately discontinue the Mega Drive worldwide. To discontinue it in Japan? Totally understandable. To discontinue it in the US? A bit rushed to say the least. To discontinue it in Europe? Utterly baffling and one of the worst decisions that Sega had ever made. The console was still hugely popular. But, well, yeah. I think the OSW folk probably sum this one up best.
Fuck you, Britain!
The SNES stuck around after 1995 happily for a good couple of years or so, during which time some fantastic late period titles were released, from the staggering Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, to the quite underrated in my opinion Donkey Kong Country 3, to the how the hell are you even here port of Street Fighter Alpha 2, the last SNES game I bought back in the day. Until finally the system closed its doors around about 1998. It achieved well in its late period and cruised nicely into retirement, as opposed to being snuffed out way before its time. The final games released for the two consoles in the region were the SNES's quite appalling Lucky Luke from October 1997, and the Mega Drive's FIFA Road to World Cup 98, which started the trend of EA releasing footy games for a machine way after its time had gone. Also interesting to note that two of the last games for systems here in this video, for the SNES and Master System, were both licensed games based on French comics by Infogrames. Just thought I'd point it out. As far as other bits of hardware goes, it's a similar story to the rest of the world. The Mega CD and the 32X didn't do an awful lot to affect system sales, in spite of, particularly in the Mega CD's case, a whole load of advertising. The SNES obviously didn't have anything like that, but Super FX hype helped STARWING become one of the biggest selling SNES titles in the PAL regions, despite its absolutely whopping price tag. I think it was £70? £80 maybe? It was huge. But while there were so many great games for Nintendo, Sega were able to keep up the pace with great games of their own, and they swapped the top spot in the multi-platform charts week after week. In terms of platform-specific magazines, they were also virtually neck and neck. There were just so many of them. Indeed, too many of them at one stage. I mean, to think there was a time where you could happily buy one or maybe even two new games magazines every week. Unbelievable, eh? And so, what about the final results? In the end, the Mega Drive did beat the SNES in terms of raw numbers, although that doesn't tell the full story really. It all comes down to the head start that the Mega Drive had. It's not just that it had 18 months on the SNES in Europe, but think of all that came out during that period, including of course that spiky blue hedgehog. But once the SNES finally hit Europe, they basically hit the ground running and never stopped. The SF2 pack in particular certainly helped Nintendo to have a bit of a rolling start, and from there on they certainly made their mark on the European market in a way that the NES didn't. One other major thing that they did here is just about every Christmas there would be another massive push for the SNES with another major pack-in title. I believe Christmas 93 was Super Mario All-Stars, and then Christmas 94 the pack-in title was Donkey Kong Country. Christmas 95 might have been Yoshi's Island, but I'm not totally sure about that. In the end, however, it just wasn't quite enough to make up the numbers. I mean, to be fair, the Mega Drive had probably sold over 1 million by the time the SNES arrived, so it's not like the SNES didn't do phenomenally well over here too. As for what this all meant in terms of the worldwide war between SNES and Mega Drive, it's tough to say, but it certainly did have an impact. It's often quoted that the SNES worldwide sold 50 million units and the Mega Drive or Genesis or whatever only sold 30 million, which doesn't take into account that the Mega Drive basically stopped production entirely in 1996, and Nintendo didn't stop production of the SNES until, 2004 I believe. There is still a lot of debate as to just who won the 16-bit wars in terms of sheer numbers, and honestly, with how murky sales figures are, it's probably something that will never actually be resolved, honestly. I mean, the stakes are just too high. But in terms of Europe, we can say, looking at the figures that are out there, that Sega did win that one, without a doubt. In the long term, Nintendo continued to cultivate the European base with the N64, resulting in huge sales for that machine, while Sega, as we know already, after 1995, basically broke down all that they'd set up. But as far as this battle went, it's kind of corny to say, but in Europe, well, we were all winners. Except for Nintendo, obviously, because they lost. Ah dear. Bye for now. And so another video is in the books. Many thanks for watching, and if you wish to see more, then do please consider subscribing. Now let's get on to the Roll of Champions. First off, I would like to especially thank the following by reciting their name in the form of song. Taylor Armand, Lee Norris, and Griffin Blackpool. I told yous on the page I was going to do it, and I did it. And thank you very much for your continued awesome love and support. There are other people in the World of Champions who should also be vocally thanked for their amazing support over the past month and indeed any month. And they are Mark Johnson, Mark Johnston, Tim Lentz, Robert Kelly, Russell Hugo, Gerard Morris, Scott Coulter, Paolo Leary, Graham Kamak, Scott Mitten, Nicole Ketchum, The Ninth Demon, Peter Sidon, Ludwig Holmstrom, John Ezell, Kit Leary, Elle O'Brien, Dave Parkinson, and Olaf Albine. Thank you so much for the continued love and support. And hey, if you wish to show some love and support for the channel as well, you could always consider subscribing, following me on my social media links, and indeed donating to my Patreon, especially if you wish to be immortalised in a video in such a way. Every bison dollar, every like, every follow, every subscription brings us that little bit closer to the singularity. But for now, wherever you are, and whoever you be, have a good one, and thank you for watching.